Yes.
wise men, he called them, were affront
Yes.
people. And they'll say, well, who? Name names. I want names. And so you proceed along that line and say, okay, in this book, the Institute for Advanced Study was the branch, like All Souls College over in England, in this country. This is according to Quigley.
You know, it sounds like you're reading my book, almost verbatim.
Abraham Flexner is at the nexus of this thing. Now, Flexner was a key because back at Johns Hopkins, he got out of there in 1886. This was right after G. Stanley Hall had come to Johns Hopkins. Hall had been the first graduate student, PhD, of Wilhelm Wundt at the Leipzig School over in Germany, and Wundt's great-grandfather was codenamed Raphael with the Illuminati.
Mm-hmm.
When he gets over here, Daniel Coit Gilman, Skull and Bones, is president of Johns Hopkins. Flexner is at the nexus because he's part of what was called the Educational Trust. In 1915, this was a group of leaders who said, we're going to take over education, get our people in key positions. One of them was George Strayer, who would become head of the NEA and say, give them the axe if they don't do what we say. Flexner was also with the Carnegie Foundation, which is a key, and then he went with the Rockefeller General Education Board in 1912. A little bit later, Judge Highland found a note about a secret meeting, and he would use it, Highland would, to run for mayor, to become mayor. And he said, look, I found this secret meeting was going on where Flexner and the rest of you were trying to get a certain individual named Wirt to become head of the Board of Education of New York and institute an outcome-based education, schools to work initiative. And when he became mayor, Highland said, I'm getting rid of the Rockefeller agents in education because you're training these youngsters for the mill and the factory just like Chinese coolies. And what they had done was, when you mentioned socialism, the plan was along that line in the sense that Stalin, even before the Russian Revolution in 1917, in 1913, he was given a speech in Vienna in January, and he said, I'm having trouble getting my Marxist cadres into place. So what I'm going to do is I'm developing a strategy of regionalism. That way, I can break down loyalties, national patriotism, by funneling people's attentions toward regional arrangements, let's say like a NAFTA in economics. That way, I can have my class struggles, the corporate elite against the masses of workers, and I can use the slogan, workers of the world unite, and so forth. So what you have then is a key person at the nexus here. You find that the round table groups, these are the semi-secret groups that Rhodes, after he's died, has in place to get key people into the fields of journalism, education, economics, and politics. Up to 1963, the roundtable groups are led by Lord Brand, Robert Brand, and that's important because he's managing director of Lazard Brothers, big international banking house. After 63, same thing. Adam Maris is managing director of Lazard Brothers and heads the roundtable groups. Now, that's important because today, Bill Clinton tried to get Felix Rohatyn onto the Federal Reserve Board, and Rohatyn is the key figure with Lazard Brothers. And when he was testifying before Senator Ernest Hollings' Commerce Committee about GATT, he actually came out and made something of a veiled threat. He said, look, the international financial community has already anticipated you're going to pass GATT, and if you don't, there are going to be dire international consequences to that. The way that fits with the Rhodes scholars is Richard Gardner, whom Clinton appointed as our ambassador to Spain, was a Rhodes scholar. In 1974, Gardner is the one who wrote in Foreign Affairs that they're going to get to the House of World Order by eroding national sovereignty piece by piece. And then he goes on to explain how they use GATT to do it. After that, Strobe Talbot is another appointee, Bill Clinton's roommate at Oxford University. He wrote in Time magazine, perhaps national sovereignty was not such a great idea after all, and the case for world government is clinched. After he wrote that, Clinton wrote a letter to the World Federalist Association. I have a copy of the letter with Clinton's signature. Clinton is congratulating the WFA for giving Strobe Talbot one of their Norman Cousins Global Governance Awards for that specific article. And in the letter, Clinton specifically says, your past president, Norman Cousins, worked for, quote, world government, quote, and Clinton concludes the letter by wishing the WFA, quote, future success, quote. Now, another Rhodes Scholar, there's many, we won't go into all of them, but one is Ira Magazina, who was behind Hillary with her health plan and her certificate of initial mastery, and Robert Reich. Reich wrote, just before Clinton became president, he wrote the book called The Work of Nations. And in there, Reich is saying, quote, there will be no national products or technologies, no national corporations, no national industries. There will no longer be national economies. And he goes on to explain how we're just going to have these skillful workers and the other less skilled will be consigned to a declining standard of living. And that's the problem we'll have to face. Other people, not just, like I said, that's only one strand. The Skull and Bones is another strand, where you'd have Winston Lord appointed to a high-level position in the Clinton administration. Just as Clinton is becoming president, he delivers a speech on September 29th of 1992 saying that, to a quote, to a certain extent, we're going to have to yield some of our sovereignty, which will be controversial at home. Under NAFTA, some Americans are going to be hurt as low-wage jobs are taken away. So there's this series of individuals like that within the administration, or they may be outside, like Walter Wriston, he was head of Citicorp, and he wrote a book called The Twilight of Sovereignty, where he says it's going to be gone. That's just the way it's going to be. And so what you have is inside the administration, outside the administration, key individuals. Now, when you raise the question of socialism, the way that fits in as to what they're getting us towards is sort of a synthesis, basically a synthesis of Western capitalism and Eastern communism into a worldwide socialism.
Mm-hmm. That's the justification, is a compromise so that it will prevent wars over these ideals. But it's really part of an old plan which goes along the idea of the Hegelian dialectic, which is that everything in life that is opposing leads to a conflict, which creates then in its outcome a synthesis, which ultimately ends up with less and less opposing ideologies, and ultimately we'll end up with just two, which will then have a conflict and come up with the ideal method of ruling and dealing with people and economies and governments and things like that.
Absolutely. That's exactly right. The plan for many years was to create such a synthesis. I'm going to divert just for a minute, because what you raised is sort of the economic background. What they would try to do in an economic sense was created by a certain debt procedure, whether it's the 1907 panic, which led to bank closings and inflation and unemployment. So people would say, oh my goodness, we need a managed economy, give us the Federal Reserve. Or the same sort of thing in 1929 with the Great Depression and so forth. They would deliberately do this sort of thing. There's been plenty of testimony by congressmen like McFadden saying how our money would go on the one hand to the Nazis in 32, and in the 33 would give from the Federal Reserve a tremendous amount to the Soviets on the other side. Both sides would get it. Mm-hmm. And McAdoo, who was Wilson's treasurer, would say the same thing. He said, I fear that there are many men in high places, and we're just going to become a puppet government. And then it branches out into the Bank for International Settlements today. So, I mean, it's even so blatant that you have quotations, visuals at the New York Times. There was an article in August of last year by a fellow named Bradshaw saying these people with the stroke of a pen can alter the economies of the world. But anyway, back to the socialism. Strobe Talbot's brother-in-law is Derek Shearer. And Shearer had done a couple of books some years ago. In 1980, one of them, he's a friend and advisor of Clinton. Clinton was going to give him a high-level position, but when some senators got wind of his connection with the Institute for Policy Studies, they nixed that. But anyway, Shearer had written Economic Democracy, promoting socialistic ideas like national health care and insurance. And in there, he talked about a vision and change and so on in 1980. And he said, what we got to do is we won't call it socialism. We'll say economic democracy. We'll get this Democrat to run on our principles, and he'll institute what we want. A few years later, he revised that into what's called a new social contract, where he talked that we need the collective good, that sort of term. And then he said, quote, whether this is labeled a step toward democratic socialism, we leave for the theorists. In other words, it'd be socialism, we just won't call it that. And Schurer was not alone in this push. You had both Bill and the other co-president, Hillary, involved in this. And Hillary's guru, so to speak, was Michael Lerner, who edits Cocoon magazine. And back in the 70s, Lerner wrote a book called The New Socialist Revolution. That was the title of the book. And he said, we're going to use education, we'll manipulate it into training skilled workers and so forth, and we'll just have socialism. Hillary was writing an article in the Harvard Educational Review the same year talking about how children were not just the parents' responsibility, but the broader society. Government really has a role. Now, the way that all fits is Hillary Clinton was on the board of something called the National Center for Education and the Economy, and this goes back to my own personal background. Just as I was coming into the federal government, someone named Mark Tucker, a Carnegie person, was leaving the exact division that I was in the Department of Education. Tucker went to head up this National Center on Education and the Economy. Well, right after Bill Clinton wins, Tucker writes a letter to Hillary Clinton, and he says, I've just come out of David Rockefeller's office, and Rockefeller's also on their board, and he says, we're, quote, celebrating, quote, Bill Clinton's victory because it's going to give us a chance to put into place our human resource management system from cradle to grave for everybody, one system. And so what they do is they push this sort of school to work. This is a big controversy today in Congress, which is a combination of the old Soviet polytechnical system and the German apprenticeship system, heading towards, in terms of what you just said about a synthesis, I guess we call it a techno-feudal, F-E-U-D-A-L society, where it would be like the old feudal society with the elite at the top, similar later to the French Revolution, where you had these philosopher kings and these peasants underneath. But it would be a techno-feudal society where you had these highly trained elite individuals who were very much versed in computers and so on, and then the masses of largely unskilled or service industry types of people. And these were actually predicted in several books. One was called The Lord of the World by Robert Benson, and
I wrote exactly the same thing in my book, that America, in fact, would become a service society to the rest of the world.
That's right. And when Benson did that in 1907, he predicted that, now remember, this is 1907.
Right.
And he says in 10 years, communism will come to the fore in 1917. Then he said in 1989, there would be Western free trade is the scheme to bring it into place. Then he said 1998, there'd be ministers of euthanasia to get rid of the people they don't want, so on. But even before him, Jack London had written a book called The Iron Heel in 1907, same year. And this book is where Orwell got the phrase boot stamping on a human face forever in his book 1984. And London said the actual text that the oligarchs and the plutocrats would use would be Our Benevolent Feudalism by a fellow named W.J. Gent, G-A-T-N-T, in around 1902. And Gent laid it all out. The quotes are too long. I don't want to read them. But he specifically said what you were just saying is happening today. And he says, this is the plan. This is how they're going to do it. This is the way they're going to do it. He spelled it all out. Now, the reason I also bring up Gent is there's what's called the H.G. Wells Archives in this country, and it's in Champaign-Urbana at the university there. And you can actually get the letters going back and forth between Wells and Churchill and Rudyard Kipling and Gent and all of these people, Bernard Shaw. In fact, I got one letter where Churchill is writing to Wells. Wells has been talking to him, and he says, look, I can't talk about this outside the secret circle. I mean, he puts that, in this letter.
Mm-hmm.
And so you get these letters, the private documents and papers of these individuals, and Ghent is writing to Wells saying, look, I'm sending this woman over there. She's interested in socialism. The fate